Hey everyone. All right. Today what we're going to be doing is building the table components from Tailwind UI in Figma. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to show not only my process of building out the official Figma kits for Tailwind UI, but there's some interesting challenges here. So recently Figma released new features, including variants, which we'll take a look at, as well as some improvements to auto layout. And auto layout may just unlock some stuff that was previously really difficult with tables because they have asymmetrical padding now and new layout features as well in terms of how wrappers hug contents or can fill a container, different choices along those lines. So we're going to be building out these components that you see here. And my goal is to make them responsive if possible. So a little bit of this flexible column width is what we're going for. And then at smaller breakpoints, they go down to be a scrolling table. So this part shouldn't be any big deal at mobile because we can just have a frame that clips off any content that we don't want to show. But this kind of responsive, flexible column width is something that we'll have to take a look at. So we have these three variations of tables. I think we're going to start with probably creating the different cell types that we have so that way we can take a look at variants. And then I want to compose those cells into rows and then the table itself using auto layout. So typically tables, like I said, have been really difficult to achieve in Figma, so I'm not sure exactly what's going to work, but we'll figure it out together today. For a long time I was actually planning a tutorial on tables in Figma, and this was before auto layout, so this was kind of my rough working file. And you can tell that this was before they even updated how line heights worked in Figma, so a lot of the typography is kind of broken here. But the approach at the time was a lot of layout constraints using the frames that they have in here. And so, building things up row by row was a little bit tedious because if you wanted to change the cell width, you would have to go into every single row and change every cell in that column. And then a more recent approach I took before the latest improvements to Figma was for some of the preview files for these Figma kits. And this was based on columns. So ideally, I'd love to build a table that's based on rows to mimic more of what you get in HTML in terms of the DOM structure. But this still might be the go-to approach for having variable width columns that actually size to their contents. So worst case, we can fall back to more of this column-based approach, so that way everything sizes accurately. But I want to see what's possible now with auto layout and see if we can get more of that responsive design while still having the rows themselves to better mimic HTML. So let's dive in. I have my official working file here. We have a tables page, and I think I want to start out with the cells themselves. So going back to our page here, a lot of my workflow building out the Figma kits from the existing Tailwind UI components is actually I have the opportunity to inspect the code directly. This is the final definitive version. So we're going to work backwards to create the design components from here. So inspecting this first table head cell, looks like we have extra small font, medium font weight, gray 500, uppercase, tracking wider. So first thing I do is I usually establish the typography and then work my way outward with any kind of UI element that I'm building. Okay, so back in here, let's see, that was the name, was the text of that cell. So let's rename that layer immediately to be text. And right now let's search for font or text size XS. The leading 4 is the default font weight, or line height I should say, and then we're looking for a font weight of medium. And we need uppercase and tracking wider. So I have tons of local styles set up for building out these components, and this is just based on everything that we use throughout the Tailwind UI components. So you can see a lot of text styles. We have, of course, the whole Tailwind UI color palette in here, and then in addition to that, we have avatar fill styles as well as shadows and focus rings, which are new to Tailwind version 2. So we'll take a look at some of those as we need them. Going back to this text, we have our type style selected. I think that was gray 500. And then I'm going to immediately wrap this in an auto layout frame. So that'll be Shift and A. And we have our auto layout frame here. I don't want any space between items. And then the padding, we had, I think, 12 pixels top and bottom with PY3, and then 24 with PX6. Let's just double check that before we finish this out. And this is brand new with this auto layout feature where you can actually do asymmetrical padding and get a lot closer to the box model in CSS. This has been huge for kind of unlocking a lot of layout opportunities and simplifying things. Before, if you wanted asymmetrical padding, you'd have to create a wrapper frame and then offset manually the item inside of that to get any of this to work. Okay, so now we have our padding around that. Let's double check. Yep, PX6, PY3, so that would correspond to 24 pixels on the left and right, 12 pixels on the top and bottom. And I think I'm going to leave, honestly, this initial cell at that because the background color will be inherited from the row, and from here we can make some variants. So the first thing to do is componentize this. So I'm going to use Control, Alt, or K, and on Mac this would be Command, Option, K. Let's componentize this. Let's rename it with Control or Command R. I'm going to call this cell, and then this first one is going to be our head cell. So new to Figma is this variants feature, which you can see in the tool palette over here on the right, and I want to add a new variant. Now this next variant we're going to do is probably just the typical text cell. So I don't know if I'll call this like simple or text. Let's just say text for now. And if I click on this parent component now, you see that the variants are contained inside of it. And there's actually only one component with different variants as needed. So I'm going to call this type as the property name for the variant. And then when we drag out an instance of this, we'll be able to swap between our options here. Right now there's no difference between them, but let's get that going for now. All right, so back to our reference here. Let's just do a simple text cell, and this would be in the body of our table. So it looks like we have SM text and default line height and weight. So let's go with that. So drilling into our variant here, let's swap this over. I'm going to search for SM. Let's see, this would be Leading 5 is our default line height and a normal font weight. I think that was also grade 500. Let's check. Yeah, grade 500. That looks good. And then I'm just going to type something different in here. Let's say admin for now. And that's our second variant. I'm going to shift this in the layer stack using Control and the left square bracket just to rearrange our layers as we're working here. And let's see, so that's the kind of simple text cell that we have. Other variants that we'll need to add would be the row header cell and this linked cell. If we scroll further down, we have this avatar grouping with some supporting text, a cell with supporting text, badge cell. So we have a few variants we can build out here, and then we can get to actually composing these into our table layout. So let's see what we got. Let's do this text cell next. So typically when I approach components like this, I'm trying to find the most granular elements, build those out, and then kind of work my way outward in the structure. And you'll see that it may be a little bit of setup at first, but then once you're actually composing these in the layouts, everything kind of comes together really quickly at the end. All right, so it looks like we have the same font size properties, but we have text indigo 600, and on hover we darken to 900 for this link. So let's go ahead, and instead of minimizing all my windows, I meant to hit Control and D. On Mac that'd be Command and D. So let's duplicate this element here. And this new type is going to be link as our cell. I'm going to shift that down in our layers. All right, here, I think the only variation is that we have indigo 600 as the default color. I believe that said edit. And I might break this out. This is going to be, well, let's see here. We can handle it with variants. The thing I was considering is if we wanted to break the link text out into its distinct component, because it does have state variations, whereas these other cells won't. I think that might actually be the best thing to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab just this text layer, and let's paste it somewhere outside of here. We're going to add some auto layout wrapper around that. It's going to need 0 space between, 0 padding, and let's just set that alignment to be vertically centered. I'm going to rename this to be text link, and this will be the default variation. So I'm going to componentize this with Control, Alt, and K. or Command Option K. And again, we're going to add variance here. So the second variation is going to be our hover state. And if we go back up to that parent component, let's rename this property to state. Keep everything nice and organized. So on hover, it was indigo 900. We're darkening the text color. And then I want to include the focus styles in here as well. So with the release of Tailwind version 2.0 and Tailwind UI updates that happened right after that, we decided to basically let text links inherit the browser default focus styles, because in Chromium-based browsers, there's actually a really nice double outline that you see with keyboard focus. So you'll have a dark inner outline and then a light outer outline. So regardless of the background color, it's pretty distinctive. So for now, that's kind of our direction with focus styles on text links, is to let them inherit browser defaults. So I'm just stubbing that out with mimicking the exact same styles we have for our default style. If this were a button, we provide custom focus styles. So, let's imagine that this is instead a text button, for example. We have all of our focus styles that we typically use. I think the one that we'd most commonly use is this blue ring. If I turn clip content on, let's see if this will work. May not work right now. Oh, because we don't have a background color. Yeah, so if it was a button, there'd be some additional steps, and you would probably have, border radius and those types of things to make it look better. But in the case of it being a text link, we're not actually going to include any of those things there. All right, so now we have our text link, so we can grab that default variation, and I'm going to paste that inside of our link cell type. So now we already have some component nesting going on, and that's great because the cell has variations of the kind of display type or the semantic type, and the text link obviously has some statefulness to it. All right, let's keep building these out. We got our component pieces going. I want to get this title cell going. That should be nice and quick. I'm going to just duplicate this, and let's call it title. And I think the only change is that this has the medium font weight and gray 900. Let's say that was Jane Cooper, I think, is that initial cell text. One thing with variants that I hope they improve is right now you can add auto layout and other things to this kind of cell wrapping frame, but then, I don't know, the organization of it gets kind of limited. So kind of back to a little bit of manual arrangement of items, but that's fine just for documentation. I'm actually going to shift this up visually as well, just because it makes more sense to me to have these stacked. All right, and let's see here. Just a few more cell types, and then let's get to building out the rows. So we have our avatar. This will still be the title cell, but with supporting text and an avatar, so that's interesting. And then we have this kind of paired text cell as well. So let's think about those. All right, first thing I'm going to do is duplicate this title cell. It's probably the closest starting point we have. This would be with avatar and supporting text. And that kind of matches naming conventions that we have on Tailwind UI, where just very descriptive about what we get. So not spending too much time on naming for this particular element, but it's at least very clear when I come back to it what this actually has. All right, so inside of here, we're probably gonna need to wrap some of these contents in some additional auto layout frames, I'm guessing. So the first thing is getting that avatar component. In this case, if we inspect it directly, it's going to be a 40 by 40 or a size 10 is what we're calling it here. So I'm going to search my components that I've built. And here's a great example of variants with some of the existing components that have already been built out here in this kit. So we have the single avatar component, but we have different styling between rounded corners and circular. We have different sizes. So we need size 10 in this case. You can have notifications associated with those if you need to. There's different stylistic variations for placeholders or initials. So even in a tiny component, variants have really simplified the layers, because right now this is literally just a single layer with an image fill. And even then, with all of our setup image styles, we can actually swap this over to the avatar that we need for this particular design that we have here. And so it looks like there's actually a slightly different variation of this fill where it's a little bit more zoomed out. And we have that prepared as well, just because in different components, we have slightly different unsplash images that are being used. So there's our avatar. Let's drop that in to our cell here. That'll be on the left side. And let's see what other supporting text we need, as well as the layout of these internal items. So Jane Cooper, let's grab their email and then inspect the layout that we'll need here. So there's no space between this typography, and then we have margin left 4, which would equivalent to 16 pixels between the text and the avatar. Okay. So let's duplicate this text, and we're going to automatically wrap these in an auto layout frame. That alignment looks good, no space between. This will just be our text. And this bottom one, let's rename this to be supporting text. This will be our title, just so we can stay organized. And auto layout will be vertical direction. Gotta adjust that frame real quick, just so we have more space to work with. And then we'll get that tidied up later on. So inside of here, we have Jane Cooper. At the example email, this will be normal font weight, gray 500, that looks good. And then between these elements, now we have that 16 pixels of padding, and that looks good. So as with auto layout frames in general, if we have these set up correctly, so let's see, these should fill the container, and this text should also fill the container. That looks good. I believe that'll set, yeah, that should set this to be responsive. And you can see that we actually have text wrapping going on. I think in the event of text wrapping, one other detail is, let's make sure the avatar would be pinned to the top. But in our case, yeah, in our case, it usually won't really wrap to a new line, so that's fine. Okay. Might get some default sizes on these just for kind of documentation. And I'll consider that. I'll have to think about that. Yeah, that should be fine for now. Once we get into the tables, we'll worry about all the dimensions of these, but for now everything's flexible, so it's not a big deal. All right, I'm going to duplicate this, and let's call this with supporting text. And this will be a simpler version here, where we don't have an avatar. We have these internal contents, which we may not need this auto layout frame anymore. The parent might be able to handle that. So let's play around with that real quick. And let's see what the difference is. I think it's just a text color change. Yeah, gray 900 and gray 500. So this top title can actually go down to normal font weight. And sorry for all the tabbing, but when you're inspecting, you have to go back and forth a lot. So we have these imaginary titles, regional paradigm technician, and what was the optimization? Was the department? Okay, cool. That looks good. I think I'm actually going to bail on this auto layout frame here. That's no longer necessary. So let's use Control or Command Shift and G, and instead change the auto layout direction to vertical. No space between. These are looking a little funky because we had some interesting constraints. So I think we're going to hug contents vertically and horizontally. And then if we look at what happens in the actual DOM, these text elements by default, or these div elements, would be block level, so they would actually fill out the container. So I like to kind of match that in my auto layout frames as well. So these text frames will fill their container, and that's fine. And that's all looking good. Okay, cool. I think the last one we have is just with a badge, so this should be really quick. And the type is badge for the variant name. Inside of here, let's just grab a badge. So we have our badge components. Let's see here. The size on this will be a 20 pixel high version. It says active. Okay, cool. So I think that's small. Yep, that looks good. We have our green variation. And so you can see, having so many components that we already built out, every time you build a more macro level layout, you're just recomponentizing. You're just grabbing more granular elements, putting them in place. So it really starts to pay off. I'm going to delete this text that we don't need, and that all looks good on that front. Cool. So those are all of our cell types taken care of. I'm just going to make sure, yep, even spacing all these, keep our documentation nice and clean. Cool. That looks good. Oh, we forgot to space out for this one cell over here. There we go. Cool. Keeping everything neat as we work. Now for any of these smaller components that are specific to a particular category, I typically name them to reflect that category. So tables, and then using some of the kind of regex syntax that they have in Figma here, $, ampersand will include the current layer name. So this is the rename panel anytime you rename multiple layers at once. So this will be for tables. And then for now, I'll keep them off to the side. And the last step that we'll do when we kind of clean up this page is move them into a parts page that I have. So just a few components that we have here. But this is helpful for all of these more granular components to be tucked away. So that way, when you get to a final component page, like this is the drop-downs page, for example, it's just nice and clean. The mobile desktop versions, which mimic what you find on the actual website, and none of that clutter from having tons and tons of small little details that are going into these bigger components. So back to tables. Let's see here. So I think now what we're ready to do is explore a couple layout options. I would love, if possible, if we could have actual rows with the cells inside of them to mimic the actual HTML structure. And auto layout may be capable of that now, but I'm not sure. So if it doesn't work, we'll go back to kind of hinging everything off of columns, which works well. I know it works, but let's just see what's possible. We're gonna have to kind of figure this out together a bit. So this first table, I know that we have a few of these pieces that we just built out. So we have some text cells. We also have a link cell. Just grabbing some of our pieces here. So we'll have on the simple striped table here, let's move our cursor out of the way. Name, title, email, role, and then we have a hidden table heading cell up here. So let's see. So let's grab those 5. I think that's all of them. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to select all 5 of these cells. Now, if rows are going to work, we're going to be able to create a table row all at once. So let's select these 5 table head cells and use Shift A for auto layout. This will be the horizontal direction. The alignment doesn't really matter because they're all the same size, so I might leave that untouched for now. And then technically we would want them to be packed in their alignment. So this is another nice new feature of Figma. You can actually, if I were to grab any 2 elements, let me just keep them spaced apart right now. You can have it packed with spacing between, or I can actually say that these would be spaced between as in more of the flexbox layout, in which case the actual margin between items goes to auto because it's actually just using more of a layout algorithm to keep them to the outer constraints of that frame, for example. So that's a nice new feature, but we don't need that in this case. Just thought I would kind of go into that possibility. All right, so we have our table head row. So this would be table head row. And let's see here. Might finesse the naming over time, but let's just see what we need. So we had name. I think we had title, email, role. So that's fine. And then this last one, let's just call it edit. But this actually won't be visibly shown because it's for screen reader only. It's not part of our visual design, so we'll keep it there for now. So this might work. Let's build out just a single row of the actual table body, and then we'll get a pretty good idea with those 2 together if this particular approach is going to work or not. So let's see what happens. So we have our title cell. We already have our role here. Let's grab their actual job title. Super fancy, regional paradigm technician. Very realistic. All right, let's see here. And then lastly was their email. So that was the Jane Cooper. It's tempting to type out some of these things, but I've been bitten so many times by doing that with simple typos. So anytime I'm either going from design to development, or in this case, the other direction, I really try to copy from a single source of truth, because even if it's something as simple as some of these, you get bit by typos. All right, let's see here. All right, so we have all these elements. I'm going to grab them all and Shift A to auto layout with those. There's going to be 0 space between. That's looking good. And this would be our row in this case. I might just call this our head row, since it's already implicit that it's in a table. All right, so right now these aren't going to really make sense together, but let's see if there's any way we can make this work with auto layout. So we have our head row and our row. Our row would be, let's just duplicate this once to mimic a table body real quick. So we'll do vertical layout, 0 space between, and let's call this the body of our table. Let's see if this works. All right, so I'm going to now wrap our head and our body, which contains a couple table rows, in another auto layout frame. And this mimics the HTML structure, so just lots of wrapping elements here. And this would be our table itself. The head row, I want to fill the container, and it looks like I would need to grab all of these cells and set those to fill container as well. And yep, this is what I was suspecting. So if you had a table where, and you can choose to do this, but it's not how tables natively work in HTML and CSS. But if you had a table where every single column was equal width, this approach would work perfectly, because if we resize this table, you could see that the actual title rows and everything are all scaling responsively. But in our situation, we don't really know what's going to be contained in the body cells. And you can see that even with all of these cells in the row, they all have different natural widths, let's say. So obviously there's longer text in the title and email cells than there is in any of the others. And instead of forcing all these columns to be equal width, this table will just have tons of empty space and look pretty bad. We have actual table layout in HTML. So in HTML, we don't have to specify any of these, because table layout is one of the most foundational things of the web. It's been around for a really long time, before we even really had CSS to style these things. So it can automatically detect, and it has awareness of all of the contents in a cell, or in a column, I should say. And it sizes that column appropriately. And it naturally fills out the full width of the table. So this is something that's really hard to do in a design tool that doesn't have like a table layout algorithm, but we'll get pretty close with it. This kind of shows, though, that we won't be able to, unfortunately, go off that kind of row paradigm as I was hoping. Again, if you have all equal column widths, it would work just fine now with auto layout. But in our case, I think we're going to have to pivot and instead build off of a column-based approach. Okay, so not too much rework here, because it's just a quick collection of items. I'm going to keep I'm going to back up. I'm going to keep one of our rows here. This was just an example row. And we're going to just pop everything out. Oops. Let's see here. Just undoing all of our layers here, so it got a little bit strange. Let me back up one more step. Let's remove that table layer. I'm just using Control Command Shift and G to ungroup stuff quickly. Now it's worthwhile doing these experiments up front, because sometimes they save a lot of time and we can kind of figure out how they work, but not too big of a deal to pivot either. So I'm going to group just the first table head cell with the body cell, and instead we're going to go off of column. Now again, this doesn't really match what happens in HTML, but it'll actually be really functional for a design component. So it's a trade-off that we kind of have to make at this point. So let's set these resizing parameters for the cells to be fill container, and that way column width is going to be based off of all of its internal contents. I think that'll work just fine. All right, so we have this idea of a column, and we would build out columns for each of these cells. But I think one thing I like to do here is get ready for all of the rows that we'll have in our table. So since each column is going to have a row of cells, or a series of cells that basically compose a row, we're going to have to create a bunch of cells in here to anticipate all the rows that we're going to build. I'm confusing myself saying this, so sorry if I'm confusing you as well. It looks like in our example, we have 6 rows. I like to leave a little bit extra that we can hide later in case somebody wants to take this component and adapt it to have even more content. So let's go off the idea that we'll have 10 rows of content, and then when we build our final table, we might include a couple extra columns as well. The best way to show this, let me think here. I have our drop downs or select menus. I think I do it in here as well. Yeah, so in our drop down menus, there's actually additional sections that you can enable with dividers or without dividers. So let me zoom in here. And that way, if you wanted to build a more complex component, you could without having to detach this instance from that. And even if you went into a section, I think I include 10 menu items inside of here. So you can really have quite a bit of flexibility. And if you look at all of these component variations here, they're actually all the same menu component. It's just how many things do you enable or hide to get the appropriate length that you're trying to display. So I think we'll do a similar approach with these tables here and include a number of cells that will represent rows. So in our case, we had 6. And I think I want 10 total. Wow, can't count today. 4, 6, 8. There we go. Okay, cool. So we'll include 10 cells. I'm going to hide a few of them because we only need 6 for our particular example, but those are always there in case somebody needs them. All right, so let's grab Cody Fisher. Lots of clicking around for just a moment to get all of our content established. I'm going to do deep selection on a layer with Control or Command just so I can save some time and some clicks. So selecting this text, copy it out, deep select into here, replace it, and tedious work. A lot of design mockups is tedious work. Let's see here. All right. Cool, so we have our name column established. I'm going to duplicate this and put it next to it. This will be our second column here. I'm going to immediately wrap these in an auto layout frame, so Shift A, and this will actually be our body. Again, typically this would contain rows. We're going off of columns to make it work. So this will be our title column in this case. We have our text here for that first cell. And I forgot, we need to, this is a good example of variants. Let's select all of these cells except for that title cell and change it to be text. And so now we have the correct styling that we're looking for. So getting that pasted in, looks like we had an extra space at the end there. All right. And we'll have to go through and grab some more text. So not the most exciting work, but important for accuracy. Let's see here. What I might do to save some time and just to kind of show this approach is let's maybe skip customizing all of the text. Let's get the layout working, and then we can always go in and update the content as a final pass. So typically, if I was working by myself, I would go through and just make sure everything is dialed as I go. But since everybody's watching, don't want to really make you watch me copy paste text indefinitely. So let's go ahead and customize this further. So we'll have an email column, duplicating this with Control or Command D. This will be our role column. And let's see here. I'm going to reset all of these cells. If we grab this, grabbing all of those cells, selecting text, we can actually go into this instance option and reset all overrides, which will default it back to that original text. And that should look a little bit better. Save us some time copy pasting text. And then lastly, we have a column for, this will be our edit title of that column, but we actually don't want to show that visually, so we'll hide it. And that would be for screen readers only. And then we can swap this over to be the link cell type. All right, so let's see here. So we have our 5 columns. As I mentioned, I would typically include a couple extra. So I'm going to duplicate just this generic text column, and let's just put title in for now. And let's see, that would give us 6 columns. Let's give people 8 so they have some extras to work with. So again, I'll hide those and that won't affect our final component, but those are extra inventory in case you need a more expansive table, you have more content, and you don't want to detach the whole component just to work with that. We won't need these for a moment. So we have our table body. This is actually our whole table now because we don't really have a separation of the table head from the table body. So that's just the table. And from here, let's start doing some of the design aspects of this. So we have our light gray background on the table head, and then the table body has a white background. The whole table will have a border radius at a larger breakpoint and a shadow as well. Okay, cool. Looks like it has a subtle border, so let's get all those details established. So with our outermost table selected, we had 8 pixel corner radius. I'm going to set this to clip content. Let's put a white background on it, and that way we can actually apply a shadow. Let me double check. I think this was just, normal shadow, not the large variation. And this also had a gray 200 border. That's looking pretty good. Now, let's see here. What I might do, typically if we were building with more of a row approach, I would probably put the background color on the rows themselves. But since we have to pivot everything off of columns, we might need to make more variations or apply the background color at least to the actual cells themselves, just so we don't have to go into every single cell manually to update the background color, for example. So with our head cells for this case, we know we want it to have a gray 50 fill. I think that should come through. Let's just double check. Yeah, it's hard to see, at least on my monitor right now. But it looks like it is getting applied, so that's good. And then we will have this idea of striping within certain tables. So in this first example, again on my monitor right now, it's hard to see, but might be more obvious. Well, it may not come through on the stream either. But let's see. So some of them are going to have a white background, which is just inherited from the table, and others will have this slight off-white, this gray 50 color. So I think what we want to do at a high level is probably add a new property, and this would just say background. So by default, this would just be white. And then on some of these, I might actually change this to be the gray 50. And we should be able to apply this to any of our cell types. So let's go ahead and quickly duplicate these and rearrange as needed. So this is going to look ugly for a minute. And you can see with variants, it forces you to create unique variations. So if you don't have unique variants, it'll basically tell you that there are some properties or values that are conflicting. So it wants us to select a different background color, for example. So in this case, we'll set that fill to 50. I think there's a way we can kind of do this in a batch. So let's see here. I'm going to grab all of the existing cell types and Control-Command D. So that'll duplicate those. We're going to rename these to gray 50. And while those are still selected, let's select the background color and set that to gray 50 as well. Cool. Now we just have to arrange these. I'd probably want them grouped a little bit. So let's just manually grab some stuff and rearrange real quick. Again, no shortage of manual work. But the more you kind of invest in being organized up front, saves a ton of time as you go. Otherwise, you end up spending days or hours or days just manually cleaning everything up at the end of a project. So always best to keep it organized. All right, making sure my layer stack makes sense as well. And we're almost there. Okay. Probably grab all of these. Let's see if this will work. It doesn't really work. I was going to auto layout them, but it doesn't always work. So more fun that we have to deal with. Let's see here. This is when I really miss CSS. All right, let's make sure the spacing is 16 on these. almost there, and then we can go back to the more fun stuff. These will be at the bottom, so let's grab these 4, shift them up. If you want an idea of day-to-day life in design tools, this is pretty much it. Okay. Lastly, let's distribute vertical spacing. That's all 16. That's looking good. All right, we're done with that. So now we have everything we need, ideally. Let's see if that holds true. Okay, I'm going to grab all of our columns at once. We're going to open these up. So if you select multiple layers and hit enter, it'll expand all those layers. And what I'm going to do is select the head cell of each of these. I think those have already inherited gray 50. Yep, so it looks like we don't need to touch those. So instead of that, we can establish our striping for this first example. So it looks like first one is white, then we go alternating from there. All right. So let's grab, it'd be the third item in each column. And we might as well alternate all the way down our columns as we go. Lots of selection, but doing this as a group selection will save a lot of effort. And this is one of the reasons why I was really hoping that rows would work, not just to better match what we get in HTML, but managing rows is a lot more common than trying to style a series of cells together. So this would have been really simple had it worked, but oh well. I gotta let that dream go for now. Maybe one day they'll have a separate auto layout option that'll make it work. Okay, cool. So we got our background color applied. Again, it's very subtle on my screen, but you might be able to maybe get to come across, but I can prove it by selecting it, so that works for now. Last thing we need to do is the border between the table head and the table body. So we can get that going. And with auto layout, there's kind of an interesting approach to that. One other thing about Figma at the moment is there isn't the ability to apply borders to a single edge or just to left and right. You know, in CSS, we can target border top and left, right, bottom all separately. But there's some good workarounds for that. And the workarounds actually help better mimic box sizing in CSS as well. So a lot of people will reset their designs to have a border box model, or border box sizing, I should say. And that will mean that the border is actually included in the implicit sizing of the item. So because we have to kind of resort to a slight workaround for one-sided borders, we'll make sure that we actually hit everything to be pixel perfect with what we see in the DOM as well. It's a long-winded way of saying we're going to make a fake border. All right, so let's see here. So we have divide gray 200. And so the divide utility in Tailwind lets you go on a parent element and create borders between items without having to manually target the first or last child and set border top on everything. It's just a nice shorthand for all that. All right, so we have our glorified rectangle here. This is going to be called divider. And because we have columns, we're actually going to drop it in each column. So I'm going to test it out with this first one here, and then we can duplicate from there. So right underneath the table head cell, we dropped our divider in place. And let's set this to fill container. It's going to be fixed height because it's only 1 pixel. From here, I'm going to copy this out. And again, let's expand all these columns by selecting them and hitting enter. I might have expanded. Nope, that looks good. Okay, cool. I'm going to paste it in to each of these. And hopefully, yep, it looks like fill container is coming along for the ride, which is good. Saves us some time. All right, now if we zoom out, we got all of our layers taken care of. And we have our border there. Let's check how we're doing on heights, because I can't remember, I may have not ever adjusted the padding on these cells, so that'll be a change. Yeah, it looks like those are a little bit too tight. So going in here, we need px6, py4. So that's 16 on top and bottom, 24 left and right. And then our full table, we want to hit a target of 353. Yep, so right now we're coming up short on that. I believe it's because each of these, we have to adjust this. 16, that was 24 still, as I make a flurry of typos. All right, let's see. Hey, we hit it dead on. All right, so now we're pixel perfect with our code example, which is just what we wanted. So with all of those gradually kind of building out from starting at the typography, we know that everything is more or less dead on accurate with what we're building. So this is looking pretty good. This would be our first table, and this would be, I think it's just called striped, simple striped. Yeah, simple striped. And this would be for desktop. Typically I do work mobile first, but in the case of tables, the mobile view is really just showing the overflow of a desktop table. So it's better to build out tables desktop first, and then we can always modify. It looks like we dropped the corner radius and a couple other details, but the mobile version is basically the same thing in this case. All right, so with that all set, I'm trying to think of we won't really get responsive design in this case because our table is going to hug the contents of this. So what I might do, I have to think about this. I think at this large desktop break, in our Figma files, we're kind of mimicking a pretty wide viewport as the desktop preview. And to show that, we actually have some example backgrounds that we can bring into place. So let me actually check out how we are presenting this component on the site. So 1358 by 402. So in my components, I have this example background that I can drop in. This also takes advantage of variance. So I have a gray 100 background and desktop breakpoint. What was it? 402 for the height. So I like to, looks like I dropped it into my table, which is not what I want. Let me bring this all the way down to the bottom of my layers and get better organized here. Always kind of wrangling chaos in these design files. So let's see, let's get this here and center up the table with the example background. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to worry too much about making this whole container super flexible at the moment. For mobile, what we'll do is probably wrap this in a frame and have it clip visually the content that you can't see to mimic the scrolling container that you would get when you have overflow with tables. And that's honestly, most responsive tables are going to have probably overflow on a mobile view. I haven't seen too many accessible approaches that use native table markup where it kind of breaks down into more of a card UI format. So the easiest implementation is usually just to let people scroll the viewport to view data that doesn't fit on the mobile screen. So we'll do the same. Looks good. All right, so we can componentize this. Control or Command, Alt or Option, and K. There it goes. A little bit of a delay on my end. And that's our desktop version done. So let's kind of think through how we want to present. And I still mentally here actually, just to make sure, leave a to-do comment for myself. Update content to match final data, let's say. So important to leave yourself notes. Because right now I'm not going to show you the process of going through and updating all the emails and things manually, but for my own purposes, I'm going to have to definitely do that work. All right, so now I'm going to detach this instance of the component you see here and use Control or Command, Alt or Option, and B for that. Let's rename it and say this is the mobile version. Now for the Figma kits, we're doing 2 breakpoints. So we're doing the smallest viewport possible as well as the largest. So that large size was, I think it came out to a 1358 example for the background. And that matches kind of what we have for the max sizing of our desktop viewport components. And this is pretty good because you can make at least a couple different breakpoints. It would probably be just not feasible at all for us to do, you know, extra small, small, medium, large, extra large breakpoints all with these design components because it's just, yeah, it's just way too much tedious work. And plus I think most people are mocking up primarily mobile and desktop and can infer the responsive design from there. So I think this should be more than enough. As it stands, I mean, I'm gonna not show you everything in here, but each of these, you know, major components we have on all these pages are composed of many other components. We're probably up to close to 2,000 individual components, maybe including variants, but if you count all the variants of individual things, it's several thousand things that we'd have to build. All right, so this simple striped mobile, I think what I'm going to do is actually remove auto layout from this parent frame, and it is set to clip content. We're not going to have any border or corner radius, as they call it in Figma. And it looks like we keep our shadow. And what this will enable us to do is basically have that overflow effect of a smaller viewport. So taking this down to 376 is our mobile breakpoint there. Let's see what we got. So we need to, this is interesting. So our border right now is coming from this parent frame, and we want to keep that on the table. So I might actually back up a couple of steps. We're going to keep this auto layout on the table itself. We're actually just going to call this table, and then Control Command, Alt or Option and G, wrap it in a frame. And this frame is going to clip content and go from there. So let's make sure we move. Did we remove? Yeah, we have to pull out that border radius. That's looking good. Now our frame is just going to be basically mimicking the viewport. It's going to clip that overflow off the screen there. So this would be our simple striped mobile table. And then let's bring our example background over. This would be the mobile variation. Once you have that inventory, it really saves a ton of time here. All right, now I have consistent spacing in all my pages just to keep those all organized. Looking good. Get this centered up with the example background. It looks like that shifted. I never understand the rules for that in Figma. Sometimes it doesn't, I've noticed it kind of occurs regardless of the stack of the layers, but you'll grab two layers and center align them, and sometimes it'll move the larger item and sometimes it'll move the smaller item. I have no idea what the logic is there, so it's always a guess. All right, let's grab our desktop view, get that tucked over here. Looking good. All right. A few more minutes before we probably wrap up for today. So what I'll probably do is create a quick variation of this. We can at least get our simple version established, which has the dividers in between. And then it would very much be the same process for our avatar and multi-line content version. Really, what's nice is with the variants, we just swap out the different cell types and the table is more or less complete at that point. So because we have this simple bordered, or just simple version, I should say, the avatars version would be identical, except for you just trade out one of the cells for a different version. So if I were to take this first cell, for example, and swap it out for with avatar and supporting content, obviously the sizing of this column is not correct, but it would actually, pretty quickly stub out that different variation is needed. So let's show a little bit of that off. I think the simple version is going to be really quick to build, as the name would imply. Let's see here. Let's drag out this copy, get it down here, and then make sure all of our layers are still nice and organized. So we have, I'm actually going to work just desktop first again. So I'm going to copy this down for the moment. We're going to shift this down, detach that instance, and rename it to be simple. All right, now we have all of that striping going on. So what I'm going to do is select that parent container in this gray 50. I think we'll just set it maybe to be white. We could do that. I wonder if there's a way we can clear it. Detach. No, there's not a great way to do that. I wish. So with the selection colors in Figma, you can grab a parent layer, and then you can update the colors of anything that has that particular color style within the layers. But I basically want to clear it. I don't want a background color at all. So instead, maybe what I'll do is grab our columns and might have to undo that. Let's see if we can grab, yeah, I think this is what we're going to do. Set white on all of these. Does that work? A little bit of a mystery. It looks like some of these are still have the override. Oh, it's because we, I know what I did. Earlier, I manually set the background color instead of swapping the variants. Now we can't manage it from the variants perspective. So another to-do for myself. Let's see. use variants instead of hard-coded background color. All right, so a bit of a mistake on my end on that. What I'll do is I'm going to leave these background colors untouched for the moment because I have to update that approach. Instead, let's walk through what it would look like to have that simple table style with the borders between things. So basically, you would duplicate the divider that we built previously and just place it between each of the cells in a column. And so that way you actually get the sizing that you're looking for here. Looks like I'm getting some weird borders going on, so I'll have to investigate that. That is pretty odd looking. Oh, it's because all of the dividers for hidden cells are currently being shown, so we don't need those. And that should fix it up. Yet that looks better. All right, and then lastly, we would basically duplicate this column out as needed. So let's go ahead and do that. And while we're here, I guess we can correct our mistake since we're only working with one column. Yep, so we'll grab each of these. It would be alternating cells. And instead of that, these are set to background white. We no longer have any overrides. There shouldn't be gray 50 on any of these cells except for the head cell. Okay, so that looks good. So then from here, to build a new table, or if you were building a custom table from scratch, if you detach the instance, you just duplicate as many columns as you need. So I think, again, we have 5. I'm going to make 6, 7, 8, just a couple extras for people. And I'll make sure they match this over time. But you would get that basically, you get that same styling across here really quickly. Just as an example of how we'll build this last cell before we wrap up here, I want to wrap up in just a few minutes. Let's swap out some of these cell types for the one with avatar, the badge, the supporting text, just to show that, you know, building variations from an initial component is really quick with the new variants feature. So we have our with avatar. I'm going to actually swap out for each of these. And I know it looks broken at the moment. We're going to fix that in just a second. So we're going to set the constraints to hug contents, and then all of our sizing gets scaled appropriately. For the table head cell, I'm still going to have that fill the container, so that way it matches the edges there. And that way, if you did have left or right borders or another treatment on the table head cell, everything would look correct in that case. So obviously, we'd have to go through and swap this out. So, you know, instead of Jane Cooper, we have Cody Fisher, and we'd go through and grab our avatar styles and change our text and things. So that'll definitely be something that we'll need to do. And you can see that our padding here changed as well. So we might have to think through that with our simple cell types. This is why it's good to test out these variations. Because you can see that we lost that idea of a row due to some of the constraints that we're working with. So to have the correct vertical spacing on cells that aren't aware of their row, we may have to do different padding values around some of the text for these single line elements. Let's think through how we'd like to handle that. So first off, let's swap the second column for our supporting text variation. So let's grab these, and every cell except for the table head, this will have the supporting text and be set to hug contents. That's looking good. Yeah, you can see even here we don't quite have the same cell height as before. So what I might do in this case is set these to be, fixed height seems a little weird. There we go, hug contents. That's probably where our problem is coming from. So hug contents match the same height. I think for these single line of text cells, we might have to change the padding. That feels a little weird if we want text to wrap intentionally, but since we don't really have table layout here, we're kind of mimicking some of these aspects. So you kind of have to weigh what's the best trade-off that's not super tedious. Let's see here. I might go the padding route. That would probably be the best. Otherwise, you could probably do fixed height. Fixed height may actually feel the best because we're just doing these one-off instances. So it's kind of nice that it's manual because we're not really... You're going to have to adjust the sizing anyway. And I just full screened everything. So one moment here. No wonder that looks crazy. Okay. Yeah, so let's see. So I'd probably go the route of doing these fixed height for these single line cells, and that way at least the container matches as needed. Double checking what we got here, it looks like everything would be vertically aligned middle, so our normal alignment in those cells is correct. Yeah, so what I'd probably do, just to kind of show this off further, let's swap these over to be a normal text cell. That's looking good. And then I would set these to be fixed height, and it looks like 72 is the one that we'd need. So again, not perfect, especially compared to what you get naturally in HTML, but pretty flexible components overall, especially when you inherit a component as part of a design system. You can modify it as needed. You can add more rows if you were to engage more rows, as you can see. So definitely the best solution that I can come up with so far, but you know, I'm still holding out for that perfect reality where the design tool really follows the layout engines that we have in browsers, but that's probably a huge, massive ask. I think I'm probably going to wrap up here. The work from here to finish out these table components is more of the same, so I would definitely need to update the specific content that we have in these cells, including the avatar images. We would have to do this fixed height approach for some of the cells to match, and from there, I think we'd be pretty good. You know, swapping, or I should say updating from desktop to mobile is pretty simple with that clipping frame that I showed you. And the last steps would be I would move these more granular components to our parts page, get everything kind of finalized from there. Just checking for any questions. If you have any final thoughts or questions, feel free to ask them here. What's your favorite course to learn HTML or CSS? That's a great question. When I learned, I was self-taught, and I definitely leaned on, this was very early days of free code camp. I'd actually been working in web for a while before then, but that's where I kind of doubled down on my more formal learning and try to get, you know, a lot more knowledgeable about things. That's definitely my go-to for how I'd recommend people start off now. Freecodecamp.org. I can actually paste that in here real quick. It's a nonprofit, really great community-sourced content, and definitely really robust resources for HTML, CSS. They have a really large JavaScript track, which is actually pretty decent. And then I think they have some framework-specific stuff, some full-stack stuff, but the front-end developer certificate, I think it's called, is really great. And then follow-up question on that. Do you think HTML, CSS is still needed if you know Figma really well? Absolutely. I think if you are in a role where you have solely designer responsibilities, it still doesn't hurt to bridge your knowledge with HTML and CSS. A lot of the decisions that we're making specific to these tables is based on how tables work in the browser. So, you know, our initial approaches of, hey, we'd like things to be built out by rows. You know, this is how tables actually work in terms of their layout. A lot of that is based off of familiarity with HTML and CSS. In my career, I started out in traditional design and moved into the web, but it was always a fusion of both design and development. And I think that's been a real strength. I don't think that designers necessarily need to code day to day, but definitely that familiarity and being able to have, you know, shared conversations with development teams is a huge help. Otherwise, there might be some disconnects there with either the things that you're designing may not be possible in the browser, or you may not honestly be aware of all of the possibilities that the browser presents. So even you can see in Figma here, it's a really powerful design tool, but it's not fully capable of all the layout opportunities that we have in the browser, specifically things like CSS grid or even just mimicking table layout. So you can't go wrong having at least some of that bridging knowledge, some of that familiarity with HTML and CSS. So that'd definitely be my recommendation. There's a whole debate of like, should developers design and should designers code and all that? And my kind of stance on that is I think having more broad knowledge in general never hurts. It's great to specialize, but having that shared context to be able to collaborate or even to do more of the work yourself is always really beneficial. I think probably to finish this long-winded response out, probably the most beneficial thing about learning about HTML, CSS, and the web in general as a designer is for accessibility. So understanding things, like keyboard navigation, native states for hover, focus, active, visited, disabled, all those things. Just kind of that deeper understanding of how these things are actually implemented is really helpful to anticipate the needs of a developer when you're designing stuff. So as you can tell, this could probably be a lecture on its own, but I'll spare you from that. So yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to paste them now. Otherwise, I'm probably going to wrap up in a minute. But hopefully this is good insight into kind of my workflow building out these kits specifically, but Figma in general, and just kind of parsing existing designs or websites into their component parts. If I'm starting from scratch, I still build things up from a granular component all the way up to a more macro layout. Last question, why the focus on Tailwind UI? Are you working for Tailwind UI? Yeah, I've been working with them as an independent consultant for the past few months now, which they've been an amazing client to work with. And part of that was building out the official Figma kits for to kind of complete out some of the bundle of components that you get on the website through a Tailwind UI license. So this has been a massive project, and it's been a little bit start and stop as we've shifted priorities with Tailwind CSS 2.0 and redesigning all of the components on the website for that. And so part of my process the past couple of weeks has been now reflecting those improvements and updates in the Figma kits as well. So mainly focused on building these out at the moment, but again, kind of to a previous question about HTML and CSS, my work wouldn't really be possible without having experience both in design and development, so it definitely opens up some opportunities as well. Yeah, and so I thought I'd show my process here. I've thought about making tutorials that are specific to building tables in Figma. At many points in the past, like I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, I think this file is from 2018 or something along those lines, or maybe early 2019, and auto layout didn't exist and all those things, and it was still kind of unknown. So I thought this would be a great opportunity of work I'm doing actually today. This is my actual work that I need to do, but hopefully showing some of the variants and the auto layout features in the context of a real project. So anyway, I think that's probably it for today. Appreciate everybody watching, and feel free to leave questions or comments. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, hopefully you might do some streaming or videos soon, but yeah, I appreciate it. Take care.